what do we mean by propaganda after all? Because propaganda is a pejorative term, isn't it? When you say the enemy it pumps out propaganda, whereas what we do is we keep people informed with the news they need to hear, and maybe keep some of the stuff they don't need to hear from them. And that's not propaganda. That's that's our side. That's our side
persuasion.
Doing it right. Exactly.
Right, yeah. So propaganda, the term propaganda does come from the First World War. And in fact, when people first used the term propaganda, it really just was just a form of propagate or propagation, right? And it kind of came from the advertising industry. Like if you want to get out the emergence of mass communications with early radio, say in the 1920s. So advertising agencies would talk about that they were providing propaganda services, but during the First World War, it acquired this incredibly negative connotation.
Yeah.
Where the tools of mass communications in the First World War made possible lying on just a scale never before seen in human history, right? The capacity to tell lies to people using new mediums was kind of staggering. And the response in the 1920s in the US and also in the UK was really kind of doubling down on the ethics of journalism, right? So journalists in the 90s, it was kind of a heyday for journalism, because journalists like reeling from all these young men who had served in the war, right, had been lied to, had seen their friends die, decide to really commit themselves to a kind of deeper investigative journalism that would expose corruption.
Yeah.
But then you get to the 1930s and it's not just propaganda now it's what comes to be called psychological warfare, right? Like it's the tools of mass communication, but added to that now is the kind of social science of psychology, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
It's not just that you can use the radio, but that you actually have all this body of empirical knowledge from experimental psychology about exactly what you can say to somebody to change their mind.
And this matters more, doesn't it? Because we've got democracies at this point. In the 19th century, that there's less democratic pressure on governments to lead their publics, as it were, to follow them, if you see what I mean. That once you have democracies, once you've got to get the public on side for the things you want to do, the governments. So this becomes more important as the 20th century sort of unfolds. Would you say that's right?
It's only really just the beginning of kind of universal suffrage, right? And in the US, we don't have that, right? Because they're still disenfranchising Black people. But like even just universal manhood suffrage, and by the US, and in the UK, women can finally vote by the 1920s.
Yeah.
And so there's this whole emerging science of public opinion measurement, or all these tools like polling and stuff. Like, okay, well, if you're gonna govern over people and everybody can vote, or we at least subscribe to the idea that everybody can vote, well, you kind of want to know what do they want you to do, but you also want to tell them that they want you to what they want is what you're going to do anyway. Right. So this, Gallup or these early polling companies could figure out ways to select a random sample of the population and assess their opinions about matters. And then, elected officials use that to decide what to do, but also how to run a campaign. So there are all these tools of mass persuasion that we can think about as like really helpful for democracies, but they can also be used by authoritarians, right? To tell people what to believe, right? Like if that's the difference between fascism and democracy, like in democracy, you ask people what they think so you can govern, so that they can, consent to their rulers. But in a fascist regime, you tell people what to think.
Yeah, right.
But it's still the same technology of communication. Do you know what I mean? Like it's still the same kind of theory of how do ideas get from one person to many people and from many people to one person. It's just which direction the communication is going.
But Jill, can I just ask you, just go backwards to the First World War? I mean, you're saying there's the spread of fake news and mass lying and all the rest of it. But how does that manifest itself? I mean, is that sort of, saying that all Germans sort of go around raping Belgian nuns, or is it? I mean, you thinking that, or are you thinking something more, or is it just kind of sort of how it's all going? Oh, it's all going fine when it isn't.
Well, I mean, in the American context, the First World War, Americans had no real interest in joining that war, right? This is really the birth of American isolationism. I mean, Americans had not been involved in European wars, but that becomes kind of entrenched as an idea, right? That Americans should not be involved. This is a European conflict. It's devastating. The slaughter is tremendous. President Woodrow Wilson, who's an internationalist, really keen to get the United States involved in the war. And once he decides to, and goes to Congress and gets a declaration of war, he really does have to sell the public on the idea of the war. John Dewey, the political philosopher, calls it the conscription of thought. Wilson forms within the government the so-called Committee on Public Information. It was run by a guy named George Creel, who had been a muckraking journalist who'd written exposés about child labor, and he is charged with convincing Americans that the war is necessary because of the evil of Germans, right? So it really is German soldiers raping Belgian nuns, right? So Creel comes up with all of these methods, like there are these silent films, newsreels that are made by Creel, but I think some people can kind of conjure in your mind like the posters. The Committee of Public Information made these posters where the Germans look like gorillas, like not gorillas GU, but like apes.
Yep.
I mean, they're just depicted in a wholly savage manner, right? They're animals. They're rapacious. They have these like sharp teeth.
Yeah. I know the pictures you're talking about.
Huge, remember that Americans couldn't call hamburgers during the First World War. They were renamed Salisbury steaks. Like all this weirdness around like everything German was to be reviled. There were a lot of we would call now hate crimes against German Americans. Like there was just a need to whip up a frenzy that the aggressive German must be stopped. And it was terrifying to Americans who were paying attention to it as a matter of mass persuasion. Yeah. Even people who really supported U.S. entry into the war, and did think it was necessary, were really shocked by how effective it was.